It's great to talk about animal facilities relative to a campus environment, because I think that what's exciting for us as architects is there's always this balance between access and security, productivity of the landscape, and the teaching aspect of a university setting. So we've done a number of projects that try to balance that line carefully depending on the specific client need in terms of how that site can really express the most about itself, the most about the program, and the most about what's going on at the university. So Cornell University hired us to do a large animal teaching complex, little short master plan, but primarily the dairy barn. So it's the teaching dairy that was replaced because it was in the middle of campus, and as campus grew in the need for classroom buildings, they basically had to demolish the dairy. So Dr. Gard and the College of Veterinary Medicine really had no dairy for a long time. They were doing rented space quite far away. So the site was identified just outside on Dryden Road outside of campus. And the problem with this was it's very much a gateway building for the university as people come into campus from this direction, but it's also needing to be a functioning dairy. So a lot of times in academic work, you need to balance the idea of what is seen in industry and what is needed at a university, because oftentimes those are very different things. So it was an amazing site we had here in the center of the screen here near McGowan Woods, some things there, kind of composting, recycling, all going on there. So the thing that we did was we looked at the land relationship of drainage that happens existing on the site. The Cascadilla Creek is down here at the bottom. And you know, the planning aspect of the university architect's office was really interested in this idea about maintaining a positive stormwater management strategy and how that might happen with the building. So we located the dairy on the ridge space with the drainage swales on either side of it, as you can see there. We made some slight adjustments to that based on wind direction. And in a freestall dairy, really the idea of natural ventilation is extremely critical. The cows generate a fair amount of BTUs in their sort of normal lifetime. And so they do love the cold, I'm told. And we were also told at the beginning that a happy cow is a productive cow. So doing all these programmatic aspects for cow comfort was really one of the things that we did. So, you know, we really looked at the summer winds, which is probably the most critical in terms of getting the animals ventilated in those directions, and then the winter winds. So this idea of the composite wind diagram that talks about the best orientation for the barn. So that's why you see it's slightly off axis of that main ridge. The other advantage of that ridge was that it really was a downward slope along that ridge. And so for a dairy, you want to have natural drainage inside for the effluent. So it's a 2% slope across that barn. So it worked well for that as well. You know, the interesting thing is this is a teaching facility and there's a classroom portion of that. So one thing we tried to do was orient the dairy in such a way that the classroom piece, which is identified in green down here, was really important to the arrival sequence of that. So basically it told the story about going past the fields, the dairy barn, the small, the storage barn, and then the kind of small animal hospital that was planned there, that there was an axial relationship to the classroom, because you have kids coming here to take classes. Some of them are involved in the dairy, some are not, just tangentially. So the idea that the building can teach as many things as it can to as many people was really important. You also see the landscape going down through, which were a series of rain gardens that took that water and sort of transformed it as it went down towards the creek. And so you hear also the idea of the opportunity to express, you know, upstate New York's beautiful landscape and how it changes over the seasons in terms of that aspect of it was really critical to us. So the idea about how the barn functions was very important to the college as well as the university architect in terms of how it looked and how it functioned. And what we were really trying to do is if a dairy person from upstate New York came to visit to see best practices in dairy herd management, they would see something that they recognize. But from the university architect's office, you know, they wanted a gateway class A, you know, university building. So those kinds of things are very interesting to try to balance. And I think that good architecture can both, you know, have an inspiring form that follows about function. So the thing we did with this was we really diagrammed it based on the components of it, of the building. So as the general program analysis of it, you know, matched out. So we have basically 130 lactating cows in the freestall barn, which is in the middle here. Let me see if I can get my pointer to work. Which is in the middle of the space here. We have the storage barn where all the feed is kept. We have a teaching, research, and special needs area here. We have the milking parlor, which is a great term if you're not familiar with that. It sounds very nice to think about. And then the milking apparatus here, and you'll see up here the classroom is positioned above the milking parlor. So it's on the second floor. So, you can, without entering the facility at all, you can look down and see the milking process. And then we kept it open here so you could also see the freestyle barn from beyond. So that was an important aspect as well. You also get a lot of children, kids that come in from different groups and schools to see the barn. So we created this bypass or transfer lane here, which allowed you to actually get a pretty good tour of the barn without really ever stepping foot on common ground with any animal. So the idea about how that maintains its separation worked fairly well. And then continuing to map things out, of course, the wind flow is very important. So there's sidewall curtains that allow them to be open and closed depending on what time of the year it was. And also rigid curtains on the side here, which allow air to get through through the milking parlor. So here you see also then the feed movement. And with all these things, the idea of biosecurity and smart planning is very important. So you see the storage barn, which has all the feed in it. The direction of that goes down through, so it never really crosses any contaminated ground. So basically, if those tires of that vehicle are clean, when they go into that barn, they leave and they never cross any manure path, anything like that. So that maintains a consistent quality to the feed that goes through there. And then the animal movement as well. You can see here, the green is their way to the milking parlor. And then the idea of the exit of the parlor, so you can see how they cross one location here, which is where sort of it's all defined. So what happens is when those animals go in to be milked, they're in the holding area here, and then the lanes are scraped in the freestall barn and cleaned while they're gone. So they come back to kind of a new apartment, cleaned up apartment, like living with your mom or something. So it's very cool in that sense. It's really interesting too. So, as an architect, you always think you're going to be really smart and helpful, but the agricultural industry is extremely smart. I had this great idea that we would use the cooling process of the milk. So when the cows are milked, they have a very high temperature, 98 degrees. And then that we would use that heat to heat the floor as it's being cooled. So in the milking parlor, when the students are in there milking in the middle of wintertime, they have a warm floor. And so we proposed that and they laugh because, we already do that, right? So it's, the architect being as smart as they can. Also, the thing about how they stack here, animals are very interesting because a cow hates to stand sideways on a sloped surface. So the incline of that milking parlor not only takes and moves the manure down towards the main scrape lane here, but it also lines them up. So they're always head in first as they go into the milking parlor. So super exciting stuff that happens. And you can see, as I mentioned before, you have a 2% slope of the barn here. I think about a 4% here where the animals are collected. And then that takes all the manure. So the majority of the work is done by gravity. And then these lanes are scraped into the sort of manure storage area. They've since added a sand separator as part of it, which is a great operation. If you ever in upstate New Ithaca, you should really try to get a chance to see that facility. So the composite of all these things are really what shaped the barn. So what you get is a whole series of architectural moves which are in response to the formal needs of the program and the function. So again, the classroom being elevated, also being on axis with that entry road, super important in terms of the building telling its own story. So here you see the finished freestall barn. So the cows are able to go anywhere they want. They do primarily go back to the same place, and they kind of have their own herd pecking order, if you will. But we did sand bedding, which is really important for the animals. It's the most comfortable, and it's really the best for them from a health standpoint. And you'll see this little curb here so that it's designed that the cow just kind of hangs over the edge of that a little bit. And so what that does is allows them not to foul their own bedding as much. So the manure effluent goes down here, the grooves keep it off the cow's hoofs, and then it gets scraped, when they're in for the milking process. And here you see the bypass lane on the left, which, they can use it for animals to get to the special needs barn, but generally it's separated from the general population, and it's used for tours of kids coming in. So here you see it in the feeding process here. You have the ability for the cows to go and graze whenever they like. They generally go, when the food is there, but it stays up for a bit of time, but it's really a free and open area. And as a freestall barn, if you think about, the cows are always inside, but in many ways it's much more healthy for the animal because they're not exposed to a lot of hoof-borne illnesses outside the barn. It's a little bit more self-contained. And really we decided to give natural daylight to those animals and the cross ventilation. And so it's, an interesting thing. And here you can see the kids back on the bypass lane, getting a chance to see the process through the, when the animals are feeding and how they're taken care of. Here you see the side curtains on that. This is the classroom building up at the top, which is on axis with that drive lane as you come in. So, your sort of students are oriented towards that naturally. Here you see it again up on the second floor, and the way the building really turns and hugs that ridge line is what's important. So, the idea about this is really, again, I said a happy cow is a productive cow. So, we upped our sort of output per cow by about 10 to 15 pounds of milk per day per cow. So, I'm sure a lot of people are watching and know a lot about these things. I'll be very careful, but I think we're, 78 pounds per cow per day of milk. We're in the, low 80s, almost 90, a little bit over 90 in terms of production of that. So, good architecture, good design is good for everybody, not just people, but I think it's good for animals as well. And this idea, I think, that it works, that it really spans this idea of a facility which is common components to the industry, but also has those aspects of teaching to it, and really to try to demonstrate best practices for a university setting. And here you see, this is really what's closest to the road. So you get this layering of the feed, the idea of the animals inside. And then as you go further down, you see that classroom building. So the idea is really it expresses and teaches people where their food comes from. So it's really important to do that. And so, this idea about it being a ecological process, the waste, the nutrient management of the farm is really shared back to where the feed came from. So the grains and the grasses that the cows eat, actually their nutrients, the manure goes back to those fields. So this idea about it maintaining a nutrient balance is really important. And then for us, the idea that this thing was, it was on the cover of Architectural Record was great. That's good for the architect and all our architect buddies. But the cool thing was it was also featured in Modern Farmer. So it kind of, spoke to both sides of that aspect. So for us, successful projects really do that in what they do. So I'm a graduate of Ohio State, got a great undergraduate architecture education there. We've been working with the Ag College there, primarily on Waterman Farm, which is near there. So, Ohio State has a wonderful farm campus right in the city. So this idea of having open farmland right in an urban area is a great thing for the university. So, as a land-grant institution, this idea, that they can really teach about farming, where your food comes from in an urban setting is great for that. So we did a little bit of master planning on this to cite a couple of buildings that we're working on. And we're also in the process of doing a full-blown data-heavy master plan with ASG that's in process now. But looking at where entry points are, where folks are coming in, we're coming out and mapping out where supplies come in, where things go out, where utilities are, the site circulation, and also the idea of bus routes, how students get back and forth to here is really an important part too. So we use this part to really establish where the main buildings were. This is a few years old, so we've actually, the master planning efforts we're doing now have updated this, but you have a couple of key buildings, the Controlled Environment Food Production Research Complex here, and this is actually called Franklin County Extension now. So this is the extension office for Franklin County. So as an outreach part of the mission, very important for that. So this building was just completed, and the idea about what it does and how it works within that. So if you see all these small research fields that go through here along Kenny Road, which is the road at the bottom, this idea, it's like a little microcosm of a farm because they're like farm fields, but they're smaller, they have more focused research. So expressing those as important and putting for instance, the controlled environment, the greenhouse project back here to allow the foreground of that was very important. And then to really immerse this Franklin County extension within a field, a range of fields all around it was really important too. So the idea that everybody sees a direct connection to the land of that. So with that, we looked at the immediate research fields around that, so the orchards that were there, some of the things that were going on and how we could take best advantage of that. So the concept of it is really that, we basically lifted up one of these fields, and really what we wanted to do was tuck the building under that. So the goal of this project in my mind was, from Google Earth, you'd never see it. So this idea that we're not really taking away from the landscape, that we're actually doing something with the landscape, was what was most important to this. So this idea about, working in unison with nature, with things that are going there, I think is incredibly important to our future, because if we continue to just use up the Earth's surface, right, we're never going to win that battle. So this idea of in this case, where we actually tuck it under a productive roofscape, which deals with stormwater management, reduces the heat island effect, and it's just a good thing to do because of the habitat it maintains across that area of existing space. So this is the roof plan for that, where you can see basically we have deeper soil in certain areas to allow taller grasses, native grasses, to grow in that. And even the parking lot is a pervious gravel, but you can see how the fields around that really shape some of the spaces that you see. So here's a view of it from the outside. So you see how the buildings, the offices, all those things are tucked underneath that landscape. And really, straight ahead in the view in the distance is where you see the city of Columbus. So high rises in direct proximity with the building is really part of this teaching mission. And you see all the roof area comes down to that one scupper and goes into a rain garden. So the idea of processing that water in a very visceral and visual way is what was really important to this. And then in the distant to the north there, you see the research fields that will really maintain that. So from all sides of the building, you're really immersed in this productive landscape around you, within distant views of the city of Columbus and other things that happen in this, suburban kind of development area. So programmatically, it's really about teaching. So the idea of Kunst Brundage, Franklin County Extension, was really a donation based on one of their advocates that was in the 4-H, right? So she's been involved with that for a number of years. So the idea about how you teach kids how to live better, how to eat better, how to prepare your own food. So all these things were about that. And as an urban extension office, they teach folks how to manage their checkbook, things like that. There's all kinds of great programs. So the heart of this space is really this, this classroom space that's up at the corner. You see their office spaces here, the closed offices and support. And then there's a teaching kitchen at this corner, which really allows them to demonstrate better ways to cook. So super exciting about that. And then the idea about sustainability, beginning with the green roof that we discussed, the research fields out front, and then the idea about, there's even a green wall planned on the interior right here. So we put in the provisions for that to happen. So you can really teach about different ways to think about plantings, also about agriculture and their integration. So this isn't the final photograph yet, but you see how it sits with that. That was my iPhone camera, so it's not super awesome. But you see how it's all glass relating to that. And this idea of creating this big front porch. So when it's raining, kids can be outside and have, sort of this big covered porch to have activities. You could also hang out there. It's got a series of steps to go around it. On the north side of the building, the west side of the building, we use a Core 10 steel, which is very much an agricultural feeling product that really ages naturally with the landscape. So super exciting about that. You see the scupper where the water comes down into the basin. The office space is wide open. So, if you're working in there, you're really sitting in the middle of these farm fields. Again, in the underside of that green roof is a wood surface, which, is really a natural material, renewable material. And then here you see the teaching or the demonstration kitchen with access to be able to open up that door to the full classroom. So you could have an expanded program or an event that it includes catering, things like that. But I think that the cool thing about this photograph is, back to that first image at Ohio State, you really get the city, and the farm kind of like layered with one another. So there's no reason we can't integrate agriculture into our urban areas. And this is, something that we're trying to do with this project, is really, show that ability for there to be a diverse kind of programmatic use of ground with that. The other building that we did is in the process of design right now, is this controlled environment food production research complex. So this is actually an earlier scheme, but I wanted to show this because it shows a couple more key aspects of this. So again, this is that first building we just looked at, Franklin County Extension. The city is this direction. It's based on the Ohio kind of bank barn, which is a barn that has animal storage below, and then you've got sort of animals housed below around the cool stone walls, and then you've got, you know, sort of the more barn part of it up at the top in the middle, and then you got the hayloft of it. So the building is really designed as that kind of aspect, which you see in the sketches up here. And what that does is it allows you to put the head house, or all the research laboratories, all the mechanical space below the greenhouse. So again, this idea of minimizing the footprint on the ground is extremely important with that. So this idea that it's an expression of a more synthetic agricultural system is very interesting. So there's a couple different types of greenhouse spaces. There's pure research greenhouses here, including BSL2P greenhouses. And then there's production research, which are sitting on grade here, which are really the taller ones, mostly vine crop and things like that, that you see typically in terms of a lot of the production greenhouses that happen. So the idea of programming these is extremely important in how we think about where they are and where they're located, right down to where the wind direction is built relative to where the research greenhouses are versus the production greenhouses. So all these things go into the factors that really determine how it works. So you see this is the lower level of this, but within this also, there's a classroom space here, which really then again looks out to the field. So the nice thing that Ohio State's been developing is with each one of these agriculture buildings, there's also teaching space with it. So this idea about the connectivity between teaching and being able to go out to a building that's doing a certain function so you can see what's going on there is really important with that. So here you see some key aspects of the programmatic functions of that in terms of the materiality of how it works. And then some of the diagrams on the right-hand side are really about how we deal with water. In greenhouses, production greenhouses, they do a tremendous amount of irrigation. Now, while they're extremely efficient because they use far less water than typical agriculture, that water has fertilizer in it. They call it a fertigation system. And so oftentimes in the greenhouses that I've visited in some of our research, they generally just either dump that into a lagoon or they just dump it wherever they can. And so that very high nutrient base, just like in the animals, you know, the manure effluent of the dairy going back to those same fields, it's really important to process manage how that's done. So in this portion of the project, we were looking at how you might use this, you know, stormwater detention basins, which are required by zoning, right? Because of the idea that stormwater comes down. And how do you think about maybe those things could take that fertigation water when there's no storm event? So the idea of thinking about plants that have a high tolerance for high nutrients in that could be a great way to further the research in this. So while this isn't the final configuration of the building, I thought I'd share this because I think it's a very important aspect of these types of projects allowing further research. So the idea that stormwater was stored in a tank below the ramp of this. So the idea that, you know, anybody could walk up and look into the greenhouses by that ramp. And then also that it was actually hiding a storage vessel for the water that would be then used for, you know, flushing of toilets and things like that. You see the green, the fertigation ponds there, which are really part of the stormwater detention system. So if you think about expressing this idea of water, you know, the rainwater coming down, stored in the tank, and then the roof water that's come down and then stored in that tank. But then the idea that the fertigation water, which is happening inside, then that rainwater is used for fertilizing the plants with addition of groundwater and city water as needed. And that cycle, which exists to feed those plants, which goes several cycles through in terms of when it has the actual nutrients added to it. They have different cocktails available for different plants based on that. So that water is an extremely efficient way to handle agricultural growth. But with that, when it's finally finished, they need to get rid of that. So the idea is that you transport it to these stormwater basins with plants that could tolerate that. And it would be a great aspect of research that would then figure out what types of plants could all greenhouses use to better control that environmental aspect of that runoff that goes through there. So here you see the building proposal with the rain gardens on the right, the idea of how we're using different plants in that and natural and grasses that would be then very tolerant to that. Within the building, putting the greenhouse on the second floor was an opportunity to really celebrate this idea about this new type of agriculture rising up to the sun. So there's this great stair that gets you up there, and really it's a teaching area right here. So when a busloads of kids can come in, you sort of set them down there, show them a brief film about the place, and then you can actually go up in this area without breaching the security area of that. So you could come up stairs. and these two doors are controlling that access. You can really get up and see in. And also the general public would be allowed to look into that as well from that ramp. So a couple of images of that outdoor space as well in terms of, different things you can do. And then, even this, so you see the mechanical system, the evaporative coolers that sit on the ground for easy access that go up, combined with then the natural ventilation at the top to give it a pretty good systematic way to think about the environmental aspects of it. We've done a little bit of work at NC State as well. Very interesting client. They've got a couple of these heritage barns that have been there since the early days of the university, which are quite, loved by everybody. The idea of what goes in those, mapping out what exists in those. The first thing we did for this master plan, and we had, with us, we had Barbara Jones of One Health Consulting. She's a biosecurity expert, as well as 5G Consulting, which is an animal ag consultant that we use quite often. But we mapped out what all the animals that exist on the site and their numbers, and how that works, understand the validation. We looked at the site constraints to that. You can see kind of the dashed lines dividing different pasture lands that they had, runoff that happened. There was this large pond that was built decades ago, probably 80 years ago, for irrigation, right? So that was a great thing then in terms of irrigation, but now it's actually a hazard because something like this on a farm with active animals, it really draws geese, it jars a lot of things that can bring disease in. So you try to want to minimize that. So also some of the things we're looking at is a lot of erosion happening on that site in different locations based on where fence lines were relative to roads, things like that, and try to understand that. But one of the big things we did was we really analyzed the pasture space. You can see in red each of the pastures that they have. And again, they are also a university that's in a very urban area. So pasture land is extremely important. So if you think about, of all the site area, 93 acres, only 45 acres of that was usable. So what we did was we put in a proposal to actually eliminate the creek and restore it back to its natural state. So environmentally, it was actually functioning a little bit more like it was intended to. And then we tie that into a system of the grading that would actually allow there to be a much more farmland open to that. So, we mapped out with our team this idea about what animals needed what amount of pastures, right? And so the idea from a standard barn where the animals freely go inside, outside, come in for feeding, you could actually save 44 acres by doing a freestall barn, which again, many people believe is a much healthier environment for dairy cattle. So looking at all these components about how many acres were needed, looking at how we map that out, this idea about through planning of herd management as well as planning of the ground, we could actually get the potential up to like 65 acres of usable, pasture land. So as we were planning this, they have a lot of animals that you saw on that initial slide. So, from an animal welfare standpoint, the best of those strategies to really spread those animals out, separating swine from poultry, from small ruminants, et cetera, is extremely important. From what the animal wants. From a teaching standpoint, it's very difficult because when you spread them out, as shown on the right, it's difficult, right, to get back and forth. It's difficult to keep the animals fed. It's very inefficient. So what we looked at was this idea of clustering the animals together that you see there on the left. So, very different in terms of the biosecurity needs for that. So we looked at a number of different ways to cluster those animals in terms of their proximity and how they would sort of sit together. And then, settled on kind of option A with some modern modifications to that. But this idea about how those animals were housed in separate buildings and how you control ventilation in those buildings, which maintain a biosecure air environment for them, was a lot to do with how we laid that out. So biosecurity considerations are really important. Now, this is not NC State. I'm not even going to say where this is. But you can see here, this is some of the measures of biosecurity that are taken. And this is a tourist on your left. It's actually Barbara, but because you can see she's got the booties on. But so if biosecurity is a sign that is right at the animal's face, it's very important that you don't let people that close to them. And a number of our clients we work with, like Ohio State, for instance, has Jersey cows, which are extremely lovable and friendly, right? And everybody wants to interact with them, and they do. And so in that master plan that we're working on right now with them, we're actually having a a pasture or a herd of animals which are separate from the true dairy cows, which can actually be part of the public. So you can walk up and touch them and all that, but it's not going to take contaminants from that herd back in with the rest of the group, so that they sort of appear to be the same herd, but they're actually kind of the petting herd, if you will. And I think it's a great idea that the university is, on board with thinking about for that aspect of it. But, biosecurity is really important. It has to do with pasture management, how close animals can get to one another, how close others can get to the pasture, things like that. Vehicle traffic, human traffic in and out. This is one of the tours we were taking at the facility, putting on booties, things like that. Because really it's your shoes that bring a lot of that in. And most people that work at a university farm have their own farm as well. So you have like this idea of an outbreak being very possible. And as we've seen in the very recent past with the COVID thing, animal to human transfer, while not as critical in this, but you can get farm to farm transfer of different diseases. So really being mindful of the foot traffic, human flow, vehicular flow. Like if there's a truck delivering feed to the site, how many different farms has it been to delivering feed, right? That's a huge thing. And then, just animal management, keeping them under roof when possible, keeping them freshly ventilated. And, and you see the geese, which, are resting themselves after swimming in the pond all day. So, you see those kind of aspects that you really want to take advantage of solving, and then manure management and how things run off and go in different directions. So, with that master plan that we did in terms of where those animals were, it was very important to think about zones of biosecurity. So here you see the idea that we have basically a truck wash at the beginning of this plan. So any vehicle going in and out has its tires washed. And then you have a controlled access zone here in yellow, which is really a very limited to sort of specified visitors that bring feed in, things like that. And then you see a restricted access zone here. So all the farm staff go through this zone of biosecurity measures, this one here, and then, third access point here. So they actually service all these facilities from the backside. We also, in terms of the way the air flows from that, the air is drawn from the roof and exhausted to the sides and then blows out. So the idea that you're never cross-contaminating in the airflow and potential aerosols that exist in these different areas. And you'll see this other thing here, this kind of yellow line here, where we have a blend of those two things. One of the things that happens is on a farm like this is a really good research institution goes around and looks at other research institutions and shares their knowledge. And like this, you got folks from overseas coming to NC State to visit. So, how long can you expect somebody coming from Asia to quarantine themselves before you let them on the farm, right? So that's something that we tried to solve with this master plan, which was really something to do with the sectional quality of that. So a couple of modifications we made, we're actually putting the dairy in, we're designing it right now, which is actually going right here with that. But you can see with where we place those things, see the fresh air inflow of ventilation for those facilities and how it goes, so that you're never really crossing ins and outs with those. And you have isolation pastures here where you can take some of the animals out before they go in with a herd. So if you imagine sheep or goats or even equine could spend a couple weeks out here before they go in with the rest of the herd. So, much like we are trying to develop herd immunity now, the same kind of things apply to animals as well. So looking at that, is pretty critical. So here you see that the layout of those existing barns, which was key to a lot of this. So this idea about controlling access into that barn and maintaining a second floor visualization area where you could actually see the entire farm without ever stepping foot in the farm. So here you see those powerful barns, and they're real landmarks of this college. And so it's really important to maintain their integrity. So, with that, you see the barns here at the top of the screen. You can see some of the layouts in a diagrammatic form of what we were doing here. But here's the real key to this, is where you basically have the truck wash down here in terms of also a locker room, so folks could change, put on their work boots, things like that. And then, staff could go directly into the farm from here, but a visitor could actually follow the green line. So we've also got classrooms and stuff we're planning. So imagine how cool it would be for a student who is not going to that farm specifically for interactive labs. If they just have a class in that, they can actually have classroom space that sees the entire farm. So they really feel like they're in the farm without ever breaching this biosecure line here. So with that, you see here, this great loft space in the barn that existed with a concrete floor. It's really quite readily made for what we're doing. And, some of the access points here. So what we did was we are proposing floating a second floor into these, connecting these two barns with a bridge that allows you to get up and see things without ever stepping foot in that barn. So super important way to then get vistas outside of that. So here you see the typical section of that where you basically have, you know, the ability to enjoy and really get a sense of that upper space of the hayloft, which most people wouldn't get a chance to look at, as well as offices, things like that. You see the locker room space for these people there. So, you know, part of this master plan was to really look at simulation model veterinary laboratories. So that's becoming a very prevalent thing, so that you practice a lot of the work on a model before you actually use an actual animal. So it does lower the cost and the safety for the animals, and gives students more access to sort of practice that. So with that, you know, we're really thinking about how to integrate that into here. So this is the overall plan. So you see the existing barns, and you can see a very light intervention, which is really this glass bridge which goes across, which allows you to see between the barns equine demonstration pasture, and then projections which allow you to go out and get full vista of the farm. In this case, the demonstration field on that side, also the other fields, the animal fields to the south. So here you see that where you have the classroom, the office space, and this looks down at the simulation lab. So you see it's an open air connection. It's like an atrium between those two, because there are no animals down there. So you can freely look down on that and see what they're up to, and really get this broad view of teaching, collaboration, and actual hands-on demonstration from that space that's down there below. And then from the other side, the furthest barn allows you really to get a vista of the entire farm. So you can see the pond just outside the window. You're looking at the demonstration pasture, and you see each of those animal facilities on the right that are part of that farm layout in terms of how they're managed. And then here you see kind of a glass enclosed skylight, if you will, that looks down into the equine stalls below. So the equine is completely air separated from the rest of the facility, but still, as a visitor, and even a student taking, you know, that's a math major that takes a class over here, can really get a sense of the agricultural legacy of NC State. So here you see, again, being able to look out and see a full vista of the farm. So super interesting things. And you can see how here you can see active animals in close proximity without really getting in that same environment with them. So, you know, a number of things that we do are really meant to try to enhance that sense of connectivity with the food that we eat, the animals that we take advantage of, in a very humane and healthful way for both species, the human species and the animal species we're dealing with. So, you know, with that, a lot of our work really tries to integrate into an existing environment, understand the functional requirements of that, and really marry this idea about industry standard with best practices. So, you know, universities can continue to teach, you know, best practices of what they do in terms of everything about, you know, animal management, animal husbandry, teaching the next round of, you know, ag engineers and veterinary doctors to be best practices, and all the while trying to teach the common population more about the things that we eat and consume. So that's a little bit about what we've been working on at Erdy McHenry Architecture.